but unfortunately we don't have a lot of them coming in because the economy is so poor in the United States. So our capacity today is very tight. Going forward, I'd predict that we're going to be challenged with this for a long time. Exports out of the United States should be robust with a weakening dollar. So us ag shippers are going to compete with somebody for that available box. Who do we compete with? Well, this I think came out a couple weeks ago, Journal of Commerce. They talked about the top 100 shippers or exporters of containers out of the United States to somewhere and what they use those containers for. I just took the top 50 and added up the TEU counts, and the waste paper is number one. Chemical products and plastics are kind of close second and third, and then the grain guys are down here. I can tell you these numbers are wrong. Those of us in the grain business, when we try to compare what we actually did with what Piers and JOC says we did, they're not quite right. I'd speculate, though, they get everybody's wrong, not just the grain wrong, so the percentages probably aren't too far off. Okay, if you look at grain shippers in comparison to what makes up the total container trade out of the United States in terms of weight, this yellow bar is the weight of products coming to the United States in a container. This green bar is the weight leaving the United States in a container. Surprisingly, only about 7% of the weight leaving the United States in a container is grain products. I guess the positive of that is that I think we have some room to grow as ag shippers for the capacity that's out there. Okay, so that's the capacity related to boats and boxes. Let's talk about the capacity of transloaders. This is a slide that Federal Grain Inspection Service presented a few months back, showing this impressive increase in the infrastructure made available to load containers in the United States. If you go back 5 years ago, there were less than 10 of us loading containers. A couple of years ago, the market really needed containers to be loaded. It needed that freight to be reloaded with ag products. We got up to 130 container loaders in the United States. And we did that with not a lot of investment. There were very few single dedicated container loaders built in the United States, a couple around Chicago. But really what happened was the grain elevators that exist in the United States today just simply retooled some of their operations, put an auger around their location somewhere that can load containers, invited the Federal Grain Inspection Service to come in and sample their containers and monitor their weights, and boom, they were in the export business. So this is a pretty infrastructure light operation, pretty nimble. So I think the positives of that, again, for us here involved in this business, is our capacity should continue to increase both in our equipment. The challenge simply will be, what is the U.S. import picture going to look like to bring us those containers that we can reload to send back to you? Okay, so now I want to talk about taking that capacity and intersecting it with our grain. Typically, where our grain is located, or the cheapest location of our grain has the highest chance of getting put into a box. Here's excuse me. This is a Pro Exporter's map of our exportable corn, where it's located, obviously in the breadbasket of the U.S. The normal channels of grain exports or corn exports is pretty efficient, just down the Mississippi to New Orleans, or on a rail car out to the PNW, or to the consumption centers of the poultry market in the southeast, as well as the dairy and cattle markets in the southwest. But the key thing here to take away from this is our exportable capacity, barges, rail cars, trucks, very well located to where the grain is purchased. Here's soybeans. Same area of surplus breadbasket, just a little wider to the east-west, a little longer to the north-south, but same system of exports. Let's DDGs. We built our ethanol plants where the corn is primarily, so we have DDGs left over where the corn areas are. And it's largely sharing the same infrastructure that we use to move our corn and soybeans out, and that's truck traffic, rail cars to the demand centers in the southeast and the southwest. There's one difference, though. Today we do move barges of DDGs down the Mississippi River to the export houses, but the difference is there aren't as many destination ports in the Pac Rim in particular taking on bulk quantities of DDGs. It's an expression of the buyer themselves. They don't need as much quantity as, say, corn and soybeans. So DDGs as a product itself suits the container vehicle really quite well. I'll go into other reasons why. But here's where our container capacity is. This is where, and if you notice, it's kind of where our people are. In LA, in New England states, and Chicago. Our little spots here. Steamship lines bring containers where the people are. This is where the railroads built their intermodal ramps. So this is the natural location of an empty container to be reloaded with grain. If you have in your mind the previous maps and this map where our ag product is available, exporter ag product is available, it doesn't really overlap very well. So what we're talking about here, when we're competing with the bulk channel, one of the areas of competition that we lose in is our exportable capacity. Containers are not well located to our exportable grain. So we've got to move the grain to where the containers are, or move the containers to where the grain is. And that is a function of how high dry bulk freight rates are, or really another way, that's a function of how valuable freight really is. That's kind of what we're talking about in this slide, just simply that the higher the dry bulk freight rates, the higher the probability that we'll marry those up. This map, I tried to just kind of color code where we consistently load ag containers regardless of what freight rate does, and then where we load when freight rate goes berserk. And I'll paint with a pretty broad brush, but when you think about freight rates per metric ton from New Orleans to the Pac Rim back when it was 90 to 140, let's say, during the peak, we could load containers anywhere in the United States. We were loading containers with grain in California, all along the East Coast. We were railing grain to where the containers were. We were paying high enough rates to the steamship line for them to reposition containers from New York or wherever they had access, Memphis to Chicago, to go chase the grain, because we could afford to pay a high enough rate to have them repo that capacity to where the grain was. So I kind of just sort of color-coded that expression here. Where the green dots are, typically grain gets loaded continuously. Even when bulk freight rates went down to 35 bucks a metric ton, we were still loading, I should qualify, we were loading DDGs and soybean meal. Corn and soybeans themselves were muted quite a bit by bulk freight rates. But these kind of areas, you have enough natural containers that exist there without repositioning. You have cheap enough grain available that usually that is a competitive delivered value. You get further away from that, these other points like Memphis, St. Louis, Mobile, and Savannah, they kind of become second tier. You know, somewhere between 40 and 80, these guys start to show up again, and we start loading out of these locations. The other thing is that these locations are pretty seasonal. We'll have a wheat crop that comes off in this part of the world. We'll ship it out of Savannah. And then you kind of get out to this either farther tiers where it requires a little higher freight rate to justify loading boxes in California. Columbus is kind of on again, off again, in Detroit and these parts of the world, where dry bulk freight rates are high enough, that is to say that freight values are high enough, we can start loading boxes in those outer lying locations. Of course, up here in Seattle, there's a decent amount of wheat that moves over here into single car shipments and get transloaded into boxes up there. So that's kind of where the capacity gets used. Let's talk about the loading trends that we're seeing in the United States for our boxes. This is out of Piers. And again, the data is probably off, but I think the trend is correct. This trend here follows the dry bulk rates that we've seen over the last 2 years. We've seen a spike in the number of soybean boxes and yellow corn and soybean meal and DDGs that we loaded at the peak of the dry bulk freight rates. And then we've seen kind of in parallel this pretty substantial reduction in the number of containers that we loaded. Back in December,